what is it about Golden Age horror that keeps these films so timeless and keeps them returning to theaters on a semi-frequent basis? That was a question that I posed to myself last week after I had the privilege of getting to see the original 1933 Invisible Man, directed by James Whale, on the big screen at my local theater. And this is not the first Universal Monster re-release that I've seen, and it's not the first classic horror film that I've seen on the big screen either. And I'm talking specifically the Golden Age, the 1920s to the 1950s. That's really when you can say a lot of the best monster movies and some of the best horror movies, because it really laid the groundwork for everything that came later. But what is it about these films, considering that The Invisible Man was not in a small theater, and it was a packed house too, and it was not just an older crowd predominantly. There were a lot of people that went to see this. And this is a trend I've started seeing pretty much in increase since probably 2014, 2015, I would say. Right around the time when Fathom really started pushing a lot of their special 2-day re-releases for certain films. And most of those were milestone anniversaries. The only two prior to that I can really remember as far as classic horror goes was when they re-released Dracula, and when they also did the re-release for Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. Simple 2-day re-release, a Sunday and a Wednesday, and it was a double feature of both films. First one that I got to go see was in 2015 for the special re-release of Dracula and the Spanish version of Dracula as their special Halloween re-release. And over time since then, it's blown up not only from media conglomerates like Fathom, but also to just individual venues like, let's say, a local cinema like Penn, where I went to see The Invisible Man, or a lot of your local drive-ins. And there's something about these films, especially after having seen The Invisible Man, how many people were laughing. And it's pretty much a well-known fact that The Invisible Man is one of the more comedic of the Universal Monster films. It's like a dark comedy per se, because much of what Claude Rains does when he's invisible, as he starts to mentally deteriorate, does border on the line between sadistic and comedic. And then you kind of transition to other films where, like Dracula, I mean, obviously Lugosi set the image. Though I have a preference for Christopher Lee, Lugosi basically is the benchmark of what Dracula is expected to be. But this is like one of the first talking horror movies, and yet when I went to see that in 2015, that was also a very populated showing. Creature from the Black Lagoon, not so much, but that was also probably because it was an odd showtime. It was kind of like the early evening dinner time kind of showing. But still, the fact that these films are getting re-released and in different areas too, and the fact that they still draw. I can definitely say that getting to see these films, it's important to keeping horror history alive, because if it were not for films like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, or you can even go as far as like The Old Dark House, House on Haunted Hill, a lot of these films that have come out between the 20s and the 50s laid the groundwork for a lot of our favorite horror films that came later in what you might call the Bronze Age, as James Rolfe from Cinemassacre refers to it. And that's a lot of your stuff from the 70s and the 80s. You watch a film like Legend of Hell House, it's very similar to a film, or very reminiscent of a film like The Haunting, or let's say House on Haunted Hill, or even going to the Hammer side of it, maybe a pseudo crossover with The Devil Rides Out. You see this across the board with several different horror films, and given the fact that a lot of these films are being remade now. We had a very terrible remake of The Mummy in 2017, and we also had the remake of The Invisible Man back in 2020. So, are we seeing this because of people that are familiar with the remakes and are like, okay, well, let's just go see the original? Or is it a genuine interest in preserving horror history? Because many films that people have considered hits and were some of the best movies of their respective years owe a lot to our classics. Bram Stoker's Dracula, one of the most, I guess you could say, divisive, but also one of the truest adaptations of Dracula, owes its entire lineage to not only the original Nosferatu from 1922, but also the Universal Dracula film. That really got the idea of adapting horror novels into the mainstream. We've had how many different incarnations of Frankenstein? Universal, Hammer, there's obviously the 1990s Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, amongst others. And The Shape of Water, Guillermo del Toro taking The Creature from the Black Lagoon and kind of flipping the script of, well, what happens if the ending turned out differently? And I always pull it back to this one thing of preserving horror history. Our influences go back so far, and it's important to preserve them because these films are not being produced the way they were back then. It's a very big push on intricate effects and, you know, the next great digital revolution of what you can do with a film. But then when you look at films like these, this was all done practically. You know, Karloff had to sit in that chair for hours to get made up as Frankenstein or as the Mummy, when he had to basically restrain himself from having to take a leak throughout the whole day because there was no way for him to piss in those mummy wrappings. Or Bela Lugosi pretty much only learning the English language so he could speak his lines in Dracula. The much more streamlined but still arduous task of putting the Creature from the Black Lagoon costume together. You know, these films, they took a lot of time, and a lot of groundbreaking practical effects were developed just for the simple fact of how can we tell this story and make it believable. Case in point, going back to The Invisible Man, they had to find a way to make Claude Rains invisible. So, black face covering against a black background and back projection. And it gives the illusion that whatever Claude Rains is not covered, like whatever part of him is not covered in bandages, is now invisible. And that's, I think, what also is part of the draw about these movies is that, yes, by today's standards, these practical effects are considered old hat, although I personally would rather watch a film with practical effects, as I'm sure many of you watching feel the same way. But I think it's also the appreciation that people are starting to gain for that of, wow, you know, we have all of these digital fantastical things that we can do now, but it gets kind of desensitizing, boring after a while. But then you can go back and watch something like this, and you don't think that the Creature from the Black Lagoon looks like a man in a suit. You don't notice the different application points on Karloff for the Frankenstein makeup, or going to films like, let's say, The Thing from Another World. You don't necessarily look at James Arness and think, oh, that looks fake. He's obviously an alien, and it was science fiction of the 50s, a vastly different take from what John Carpenter did back in the 80s to get it closer to the original novel Who Goes There. But to see where it came from and just to see how well these movies have aged. And I always say that one of the best ways to watch a classic horror film is to see it in its native black and white, because there's something about the black and white filming technique that just really lends itself to shadows, to eerie atmosphere, and especially the music. A lot of it was kind of in the background, and it was at a very low volume, so it kind of gives you more of an eerie feel to it. And a few of the other films I've gotten the chance to see, I did mention The Thing from Another World. I saw that in the Mahoning Drive-In, actually, which is not too far away from where I live. Mahoning does a great job for preserving film history, especially when it comes to actual films on film, 35 millimeter showings, 16 millimeter, what have you. Now, if the film does have like a very damaged print, like when I went to see The Blob for their remake double feature, that was a print that was notoriously in bad condition, so that had to be digitally projected. But the one that surprised me was the fact that The Thing from Another World was actually going to be shown in 35 millimeter had they gotten the full film reel. I think they only got the second half of it, so it wound up having to be a digital projection. But every year they also do the Universal Monster Mash, where they pick different Universal horror films, and it's not specifically the monster films. I've seen it a couple of years where they did Murders in the Rue Morgue. They've done The Raven. I believe they did The Black Cat the one year. A lot of the classic pre-code Universal films, plus some venturing into their more sci-fi catalog. And there's a nice treat to it. You get to see the films the way that they were not necessarily originally shown, but a way that they were shown at some point if they were re-released, or in the case of seeing it in the theater, you're kind of experiencing a similar vibe to what people who were just seeing these films for the first time in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were experiencing. Albeit now you have to look at it with a more nostalgic lens. And I think that nostalgic lens really adds to the quality of these films. And I'm hoping that as time goes on and we start seeing more films getting remastered in 4K, that we'll start getting more of these special releases. Because it's also a good way to introduce the younger generation to a lot of these groundbreaking and iconic films. Like they recently remastered The Curse of Frankenstein. Granted, that was only shown over in England on the big screen, but it would be neat to see them as they, I presume, will go through and do Horror of Dracula, The Mummy, do their big titles for Hammer and put them in 4K, re-release them, do a special limited engagement, because many of us have never had the chance to see the original Hammer films in theaters. It's pretty much been on TV, whether it be a broadcast or through home video. And the one thing I kind of want to leave you guys with is, if you have the chance this Halloween season to go see a classic horror film in theaters, The Wolfman, Dracula, a Vincent Price film, what have you, silent film or talkie, go see it, because it's going to do better for the preservation of classic horror, and it's also going to start sending a message of, hey, we want more of these. Let's get away from these overly produced modern marvels of horror films and go back to a simpler time. Let's watch a film that was built solely on quality acting, atmosphere, and a good story. And if you guys have seen any of these special re-releases, I'd be interested to know what ones you guys have seen and what your experience was, what your thoughts were, how crowded it was, what have you. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Drop me a comment below. Let me know if there's any films you've wanted to see in theaters or any that you have. And stay tuned for the next one. We got some more Halloween-themed videos coming up for you real soon.